Okay. So thank you once again, Robert, for being with us in this. This is the first time we met this way in online in Zoom. So to start, let me ask you, this is kind of a standard question, but it opens up lots of avenues for further discussion. So can you remember, can you speak about your first encounter with Tamizdat, even though it may have not been called this way? So of course, we know what it is, but definitely the term is not as popular as Samizdat, for example, something that has been around for a much longer time. So how did you, for the first time, come into contact with this phenomenon? With this
Okay,
practice? Yeah.
I can answer that quite clearly, I think. So I did my first degree at Leeds University, and after 2 years there, I got a scholarship through the British Council to spend a year in Voronezh University, in the Soviet Union. And so during my time in Voronezh, towards the end of it, somebody lent me one of the Soviet publications of Platonov. And I can't say that I immediately sort of fell in love with Platonov, but Jan made an impression on me. I recognized that this was something very, very unusual. At that time, it did seem unrelentingly dismal to me, which it doesn't any longer. I mean, I can see a lot of hope in it now. But anyway, I did register that this was, something different from anything I'd read before. And when I got back to England, I did very quickly order copies of the Russian texts of Chevingur and Katlavan. And they were both easier for me to understand because I responded immediately to sort of Platonov's wit and satire. That was much easier for me to take in than the more sort of complex and somewhat more religious qualities of Jan. So I really did love the really fierce satire in Katlavan and Chevingur.
And what year did you go to Voronezh for the first time?
I was in Voronezh for the academic year 73, 74. So I would have read Platon, I'd have read Chevingur and Katlavan in late 1974 when I was back in England, or possibly 1975.
So by this time, both Chevingur and Katlavan were already published, in Russian at least.
Yes, I think I had an edition of Katlavan published by Student, I think, in the YMCA press. And Chevingur was probably Ardis.
Chevingur is YMCA, I think.
Okay. Yes, no, sorry, you're right, yes. It had I think did it have a Filonov cover? There was a horse on the cover.
Yes, it's this, I forget who the designer is, but and so it was only after you came back to England that you found this issue of the magazine Student published by Phlegon in London, right? And when you were reading it, did you have any thoughts? Did it kind of keep flashing through your mind via what ways could this manuscript that had never been published in the Soviet Union, not to mention during Platonov's lifetime, but ever until Perestroika, how it transgressed the kind of borders?
No, I didn't think about that.
So it was not.
I didn't really have. No, I didn't think about it, and I didn't really have contacts in those sort of worlds. I mean, the Leeds University was, I think, probably it was better for history than for literature. I didn't really have teachers there who were important to me, who I discussed things with. The only person I discussed these things I did my first wife was from Voronezh, so
Uh-huh.
she remarried in 1975, I think, and she came to join me. So I discussed things with her, but I didn't have contacts in the academic. I was quite lonely then. I was quite isolated. I didn't really have contacts in the sort of academic or publishing world.
Have you ever met Flegon himself?
No.
No. And it was not a name that was kind of legendary at the time in England, especially because he was based in London. It was a London-based publishing house.
Yeah, I wouldn't really say legendary, no.
Legendary in the kind of ironic sense, because he is probably
Yes.
known more than any other publishers for being the pirate.
Yes. I'm sorry, I don't have anything to say about that, really.
Okay. And what was it? I assume you did read, Dr. Zhivago and other things that were published in Tamizdat long before Platonov, or not long before you read Platonov. So, what
I
was
read
the first
I
book?
read Zhivago when I was at school in English.
In English?
Yeah. I don't think I read any. I don't think I read any Russian Tamizdat other than Platonov for quite a long time.
Uh-huh. And when you were in Voronezh during this academic year, if you are willing to share this, were there any books that you took with you to Voronezh, Tamizdat publications, and were there any manuscripts that you may have brought out of Voronezh or out of Russia, rather, for publication in the so-called West?
No, I mean, the only thing I can say there is a sort of strange irony. During my time in Voronezh, the first Soviet book publications of Bulgakov and Mandelstam appeared, but they were, of course, tiny, tiny editions that it was impossible to get hold of if you were a normal Soviet citizen. And most of them were sent abroad. So the nearest to Tamizdat was that friends of mine in London were buying, I think I got them to buy about 6 copies each of the Bibliotheca Mandelstam and the selected Bulgakov, including Master Margarita. So they sent me the Soviet publications of Bulgakov and Mandelstam to Voronezh, which I gave to my friends and actually gave to I had the absurd honor of giving Natalia Stiempel a copy of the Soviet Mandelstam, because the Union of Writers hadn't thought fit to give her.
Right. An Englishman had to come to Russia to give a copy of Mandelstam to Stempel. Yes. So was Platonov the first author you ever tried translating into English?
I did pretty soon. Pretty soon after finishing my degree, I started trying to translate pages from Chivimbur and Katlavan and sending them to publishers. Without success initially, but I did also, I was then, as now, I was interested in Skarsky, and I did also translate the versions of Russian Skarsky that Platonov did in his last years. And that was actually my very, very first publication as a children's book, was Skarsky from Волшебное кольцо. Yeah, then through Igor Golemstok, I got an introduction to Michael Scammell, who edited Index on Censorship, which was an important magazine at the time. This is a few years later. This is after I'd spent a year in Oxford. So I started doing quite regular translations for Index on Censorship, and that included a few Shalamov stories.
Right. So speaking of Shalamov, Tamizdat project has published an excerpt from Igor Golemshtok's letter to Mikhail Geller. The letter is dated April 14th, 1978. And in this letter, it's the first, it's still the very early stage of negotiating Shalamov's first book after most of Kolyma tales had been published in Novy Journal in a very, as we know, in a very strange and heavily edited and abridged way. And here I will cite, so Golemshtok is writing to Geller about the idea of finally bring out Shalamov's Kolyma tales as a book. And he says, Майкл Скэммел, редактор журнала «Индекс», вел переговоры с одним американским издательством и подготовил почву. Один мой оксфордский аспирант, очень способный англичанин, начал переводить его рассказы из тех, что были напечатаны в новом журнале. Делу мешает только отсутствие рукописей. So, do you remember what manuscripts you were using when you first translated the few short stories by Shalamov?
There were, I mean, it was Igor who gave them to me. As far as I remember, they were typescripts.
You don't know the kind of itinerary of those typescripts. Was this
No, I
manuscript
don't.
that, or was this something newer that came to the West after, like already in the 70s, but not in the 60s?
All I know is that Igor gave them to me. I think they were just typescript, but I don't take that too seriously. I mean, there might have been photocopies of the journal. I wouldn't swear to that. The only thing I can add that might be of any interest is that I remember spending a few hours walking around Oxford one day with Igor Golemshtok, and I think I'm remembering the name correctly, Natalia Stolyarova.
Yes.
So she, I think she, Igor knew her fairly well, I think, and she may well have been, I don't know this for sure, but Igor told me that she knew Shalamov well. So, very likely, it's quite likely that she might have been instrumental in getting copies of manuscripts to the West. I don't know.
It is most likely because I have seen her correspondence with Mikhail Geller at the Bibliothèque de Documentation Nanterre in Paris, where his archive is, and it looks like this typescript indeed was sent by her to him. Okay, so that confirms it pretty much. Well, maybe Lisa, I will ask one more kind of question transitioning to Platonov, and then you take over, okay? You said that the first attempts to publish Platonov's prose in English were without much success. Why do you think was this happening? So it was at this time that the first English translations were appearing by Thomas Whitney, right, in Ardis. But aside from that, what is your impression? How much, so because it is the same story with Shalamov, essentially, sometimes there has to, sometimes half a century has to pass for something as radical as Platonov or Shalamov to be felt, to be read by the uninitiated reader. So did this have to do with Platonov's own writing? Did this have to do rather with his very ambiguous political message, including Chivingur and Kotlovan?
I think there are a lot of different reasons.
Mhm,
Um, Actually, by far the best of the early translations was Joseph Barnes, the collection called The Fierce and Beautiful World,
mhm,
I think was the 1960s. And Joseph Barnes is he's not a great translator, but he's perfectly competent. Um, and I, I know a few people who clearly were very, very. My editor at NYRB, Edwin Frank,
mhm.
read John for the first time in that volume, I think, and was very moved by it. Thomas Whitney is just completely incompetent. I mean, um, he makes everything sound absurd in the wrong way. You know, it's not absurd because he's
Mhm.
conveying Platonov's intended absurdities. It's absurd because Whitney just doesn't understand things, and I still feel rather angry when I at Brodsky's laziness in not noticing this. So, for instance, um, Brodsky wrote quite a short Prinsislovia to Katlavan, to the artist Katlavan, which gets quoted a lot. And in it, it's absolutely central to Brodsky's whole argument. I may get the word order slightly wrong, but he says something like Platonov подчинял or подчинил себя языку. So this is absolutely central. It's, Brodsky's belief that sort of Platonov was some kind of rather mediumistic figure who sort of channeled
The
something.
the instrument of language, he calls him.
Yeah,
Mhm,
and Thomas Whitney translated it back to front that Platonov subordinated the language to himself. Exactly the opposite. I mean, it just makes a complete nonsense of everything that Brodsky wrote in that preface. And I
mhm,
just think it's shameful that that got by without anyone noticing. I mean, Whitney just had no understanding of grammar or anything. So
mhm, mhm,
he was considered. I mean, publishers loved him because he was evidently a good-hearted and generous man, and I think he did most of his translations for free. He didn't ask for money.
yeah.
So obviously, publishers thought he was a very admirable person. They actually did, a lot of damage to Russian literature, and it was one of the reasons why it took me a long time to find Farrar Straus were actually very close to agreeing to commission me to translate Chivingur decades ago, and then they discovered that the Whitney translation was coming out, and they said, "Sorry, we can see that yours is much better, but um, libraries won't buy two different translations of the same book. So it's the fact that there will already be a translation will
Mhm.
really damage sales." So that's one thing, just the incompetence of the translations. Um,
And
Second, what you've already said, that Platonov was just too radical, and thirdly, that it's been very difficult for any Soviet writer to get an audience in the West unless there's been some major international scandal to draw
mhm,
attention to them. People like Solzhenitsyn and Brodsky got attention for being exiled or whatever. Grossman, it took decades for our translation to get noticed. A lot of people imagine that there are two different translations of Life and Fate. That there was a
yeah.
sort of first translation in the 1980s and another translation in the 2000s. But actually, it's
Mhm,
one and the same translation of mine with just a few tiny changes, and it just took 20 years to get noticed because Grossman was. There just was a sort of lazy assumption that if a writer was published in the Soviet Union, you couldn't really be a genuine writer. It was only people who, well,
mhm.
okay, an exception was made for Solzhenitsyn, who was able to publish Ivan Denisovich, but then he became a proper dissident, and that was made interesting.
So you think it's also part of the reason, if only maybe a small part, that Platonov did manage to publish some of his works during his lifetime and his journalism also in the Soviet Union, that was in the way of his publications in the West?
Yes, and in a way it still interferes a bit, because there's a assumption which I think is deeply wrong, which is that Platonov's great works are Kotlovan and Chivingur, and that after that, he gradually made more and more compromises, and his later work is less interesting. I absolutely don't agree with that at all. I think that stories like Возвращение and Среди животных и растений and Patudan are just as fine as Kotlovan and Chivingur. I'm not saying they're better, but I think Platonov, in some ways, I think he actually wrote more subtly towards the end of his life. So the idea that just because they got published in the Soviet Union, they must be less interesting, I think very, very facile.
Thank you. Well, Lisa, should we move
I was
on?
hoping that you'd speak to maybe the timeline of publications that Platonov had, both in terms of the Foundation Pit and 14 Little Huts, of the first editions, both abroad and in translation.
Sorry, are you asking, what is the question you're asking?
Basically the timeline of the first publications, how did those kind of, in terms of dates?
I'm not sure I can remember exact dates, so it's probably best to just check those.
But maybe rather, you said it did take a lot of time since you started and until, well, your translation of Chivingur and Kotlovan did not come out until much later, right? So
our translation of Chivingur still hasn't come out.
That's true, yes. So does it mean that you simply put your translations aside and waited until there appeared a need for a new translation?
No, here I am grateful to Brodsky, because I'd been trying to persuade my, for quite a long time, there was really only one British publisher who took a serious interest in translations. Christopher MacLehose of was then Collins Harville. It was just Harville. I'd been trying to persuade Christopher for a long time to commission me to translate Kotlovan, and he kept saying he would think about it, and the years went by, and it was when Brodsky published his essay on Platonov in the collection of essays. I think it was a Penguin titled Less Than One. It was when Brodsky published that article really praising Platonov to the skies, and that was when Christopher MacLehose agreed to commission me to translate Kotlovan.
So it was about 88, because that volume came out in 87 or 86.
Yeah, that's about right, yes.
So what kind of approach do you take to translating Platonov texts? Do you kind of go for the more verbatim, word for word, to kind of maintain the whole original integrity of the author, or do you kind of do it in a way that ends up being easier for the English-speaking audience? And which way do you think is more suitable for a writer like Platonov?
Well, you may be aware that we translated Kotlovan twice. The first time I translated him, I didn't really have any helpful contacts in academic world to help me with him. So we did, well, there was a great deal about Platonov's style that I did not understand at the time. So to some degree, we did normalize the style in English. And then from some time in the early 90s, I started first regularly going to Platonov conferences and seminars in Moscow and Petersburg, and then eventually meeting up towards, I think probably 1999 or 2000, meeting the very brilliant scholar Olga Merson for the first time, who was written brilliantly about Platonov. And so all these people have helped me a great deal to understand Platonov's style. But something I do think is worth saying is that it's no good just saying that Platonov sounds odd in Russian, so you should make it sound odd in English. That's not enough. Platonov is expressive, and anyone can write odd English. Any idiot can write strange English. Platonov is interestingly and expressively odd in Russian. Every time that Olga would frequently reproach me during our correspondence, saying that my English was too normal, that Platonov's use of this particular word is very strange, and I would say yes, but why does he use that particular word? And a lot of people would just say, oh, well, that's Platonov for you. That's what Platonov does. But eventually, between us, Olga and I would eventually come up with some answer that there always actually is a reason, that Platonov has chosen a particular word because it has biblical allusions, or because it has, it alludes to some recent article in Pravda, some speech by Stalin. Platonov's language is just dense with allusions to all kinds of literary, philosophical, religious, and topical political goings on. And, one needs to understand those if one's going to be able to come up with any kind of equivalent in English.
So also, speaking of allusions, there's also a lot of difficulties in translating when it comes to the language of utopia. Did you encounter any difficulties, and what were they into translating it in English?
We have utopias and anti-utopian literature in English. I'm not sure there's any particular issue.
I think this is also something that derives from Brodsky's essay, where he says that, well, to what extent foundation pit is dystopia is problematic, right? It's not quite a classic dystopia. And what Brodsky does is he kind of turns it to, he accentuates the linguistic kind of orchestration of dystopia as a genre, and this is precisely what he says, that Platonov writes in the language of this utopia, which I think is must be quite a different thing to translate into a language which perhaps does not have this historical experience, even though Orwell wrote 1984 in English, of course. Not
well, Orwell did write 1984, and Huxley wrote Brave New World.
Too, yes.
And all languages have their countries have their bureaucracies, and their linguistic. And for me, the biggest issue has been actually trying to understand what Platonov wrote. Finding their language is once we've really understood what he wrote, has actually not seemed such a big problem.
So we can pretty much safely dismantle Brodsky's theory that language itself is responsible for the history of the nation that speaks it?
To me, that seems too grand a theory, yes.
Interesting.
Brodsky has a gift for coming up with sort of very memorable half-truths, which
Right. Yeah.
they have the virtue of setting one thinking, but
Mm-hmm.
I think one should sometimes beware of taking them as too absolute.
Mm-hmm. What do you think Platonov would himself think about what Brodsky wrote about him had he had the chance to read it?
I think I probably need longer to think about that. Platonov certainly wanted to be understood
Mm-hmm.
by as wide an audience as possible. He definitely his friend Vasily Grossman wrote about. Grossman was a bit sort of skeptical about modernist writers.
Yeah.
He referred to people like Mandelstam as, okay, very brilliant, but he's a jeweler, a juwelier, rather than someone who bakes daily bread. He's not someone who makes nasushny chlieb. And I think both Grossman and Platonov wanted to provide their readers with nasushny chlieb.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Platonov might have thought Brodsky was making things too complicated, but who knows?
Right.
I don't.
I also have a question regarding 14 Little Huts. You've changed some of the names, like Suineta into Fatila, Anton, Endov, and Kontsov, and some of the names of the writers. Can you speak as to why it prompted you to do that?
I think I probably provided notes, haven't I, which explain that, which would probably be better than anything I can remember right now. I mean, Suinita, because I associated the word with sueta, meaning vanity or futility. And Kontsov, well, that obviously is Endov. And the writers in question, they clearly are all modelled on real writers like Pilniak and Pavlenko.
Mm-hmm.
I don't always translate proper names, but these names seemed so obviously intended to evoke immediate associations in the reader that they definitely did need to be translated.
How do these two texts, given that the play 14 Little Red Hats was written just approximately a year or two immediately after the Foundation Pit, and kind of takes it a bit, perhaps a step further, the subject matter of the Foundation Pit, it assumes it's kind of afterlife of sorts, right? In the 14 Little Red Hats. Well, maybe Lisa, this was probably one of your questions. When they were written pretty much immediately, one next after the other, your translations of those two texts are probably much more spaced out, right, in time. You must have worked on the play much later, right? And still, how do they fall together in your vision of Platonov's hypertext, not just confined to one specific work, but a narrative of Platonov that he kept writing and writing despite the differences between the separate works?
I mean, there are quite a lot of very memorable passages of dialogue in Katlavan.
Mm-hmm.
some of the dialogue about precisely things like coffins and so on. So there are certainly parts of the Katlavan that are close to drama. I've always been a bit puzzled that that these Bushki aren't better known. You know, I don't understand why why the play doesn't get produced more often. I think I see the play as probably Platonov's blackest and most extreme of all his works. I've had very little to do with the theatre in my life, but during my years teaching part-time at Queen Mary University in London, I did produce there's a tradition there of doing a Russian language play. The students do a Russian language play every year. And I did direct the Red Huts in Russian with the students. And I did just, I was a fairly, I think in many ways I was a fairly passive director. I just sort of let the students get on with it, and I didn't intervene all that often. I didn't have a kind of any terribly strong vision that I was trying to impose on the play, but I did just marvel at the dialogue, every day after day, just hearing people speaking this dialogue. It just seems so astonishingly direct and no holds barred. Definitely Platonov at his most succinct and most extreme, particularly that passage I can't quite quote, but someone is can you remember the name of the activist, the very the most rigid and Soviet-minded of the anyway, whatever his name is, he says something like sort of "Разве у нас можно пищей жить? Я сознанием живу." Something astonishing.
And it's as if it comes straight out from the mouth of Voshev in Kotlovan, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Interesting.
On the subject of his plays, I just wanted to mention, because I'm not quite sure you didn't mention it yourself, that in the book published by Columbia University Press of Platonov plays that we did a few years ago, the other play, Sharmanka, that was, sorry, her name slipped out of my mind. That was originally translated by a woman, and her translation was an American woman, I think in New York. Her translation just didn't get noticed at all. It was a pretty good translation. It was just published. It was just published in a journal called Theatre, and it was, one of the reasons I was keen to bring out that book was that there was this existing good translation of Sharmanka, the kind of only relatively early translation of Platonov that I admired, and it had just not been noticed. So, so we did revise it quite a lot for.
And 14 Little Red Hats was for the first time published in Russian in 1972 in Grani, in Frankfurt. When did you first read this play?
I'm not sure. I can't remember that clearly.
But you don't think it was back then in the 70s? Much later?
Probably. I really can't remember.
Okay.
Are there any other known English translations of 14 Little Red Hats?
Any into other languages?
No, in English, because I've been doing some searching and I really
No.
haven't seen anything else published.
No.
No, this is the first, yes.
Yeah.
These other questions?
Not that I can think of right now.
What is your most lasting memory of facing a typical Platonov challenge when translating him? Whether it's the Foundation Pit or the plays, what was it that gave you the most thought and perhaps excitement and perhaps a failure?
So what was the last word? Perhaps a
Failure.
failure. I think one of the most remarkable sentences in Platonov is from quite early in Chivingur. It's when Sasha Dvanov is standing over when he's been thrown out of his house, when he's going to go begging, and so he leaves the village and he goes past the graveyard. He visits his father, the grave of his real father, the fisherman who committed suicide, and it says something like "Jak tibie skora umaru." That use of umirates as a verb of motion, utterly impossible, and yet it's absolutely how a child could think. It's completely wrong and it's completely right at the same time. It's not Platonov being clever. It's Platonov actually thinking with the directness of a child. People often sort of, a lot of Russians sort of marvel at, how can you, an Englishman, translate Platonov? He's so complicated, but I think quite often it's just that he's actually so shockingly direct that people find it so difficult to take in. There are many other writers, and I often get quite badly confused reading Isaac Barbil, for instance, who often does sort of complicate things. So I think of Platonov as being often very straightforward and direct. Okay, there may be a dozen subtexts that it takes a long time to grasp, but the central meaning is often very clear. So that's one sentence I always remember and have never been able to translate adequately. How
did you render it?
I can't remember because it's, I've just been through hundreds of different versions and none of them are good enough. The other a sentence I often used to quote when Russians asked me, why do I admire Platonov so much, is Safronov, I think, from the Foundation Pit. Safronov is uncharacteristically being rather sort of hopeless and depressed. He's looking out into the sort of bleak evening, and let me just pause for a moment and just get the sentence right in my head. Неужели внутри всего света тоска, а только в нас одних пятилетний план? So that sort of bringing together of those two words, toska and пятилетний план. One is a sort of archetypal or sort of emotional Russian metaphysical longing sort of word, and then such a Soviet word as пятилетний план, and the sounds are all absolutely perfect. Внутри всего света. You would weaken it if it was внутри всего мира. That would be weaker. Внутри всего света. It has a tougher sound of the ts and the s's as toska. So that just seems to me as fine as anything in Mandelstam or Tsvetaeva or any of the great 20th century poets. And I think we did, check in our latest version of the foundation, but I think we did reasonably with that sentence. It's a little bit more complicated than Jak ciebie skoro. And the complicated things are often easier to translate. It's kind of, when it's just a tiny, tiny little sentence, just a few words, Jak ciebie skoro, you've got no room to maneuver. So I think those are two of the most memorable sentences for Platonov.
Well, perhaps.
Can I ask Lisa, what drew you to Platonov?
It was an accident, actually. So Yasha introduced me to his Tamizdat project, and we were kind of talking about basically what kind of work I could read and maybe start translating to kind of parallel what we were reading into our class. And then one of the works we were reading was the Foundation Fit. So we just kind of worked off from there. He sent me a review to translate. I kind of typed it up, did some more research, did some more reading, and then kind of collaboratively made this project in terms of what I was writing about.
Thank you.
No, but the paper that you wrote is much more interesting than just typing and translating reviews of Platonov in Tamizdat.
That's what got us there.
Yes. Well, if it's good enough, maybe we can someday send it to Robert to take.
Yes, please do.
Robert was a very generous reader of one of my papers about Shalamov, I remember.
Please do send it, Lisa. I'm very interested.
So just to perhaps wrap up, last big and impossible question would be, contextualizing, situating Platonov in Tamizdat as a literary practice and political institution as we define it in general in the 70s, or late 60s and 70s onward. How much does he fit into this very, or doesn't rather fit into this pretty binary paradigm of publishing contraband Russian literature in the West during the Cold War? What is that he did that no other Russian writer perhaps accomplished by having written these texts that were never published at home during his lifetime and until the late 80s, but those that nevertheless made their way elsewhere, abroad, and were first read by the Western interpretative community, the immigration, of course, but also the Slavists, the English readers, and thanks to you and other translators. So what is his place, Platonov's place in Tamizdat as a phenomenon, as a token of this late 20th century post-Stalin literary culture on both sides of the curtain?
I think, unlike Grossman, Platonov hasn't yet won the reputation he deserves in the West. There aren't that many English language writers who have really responded to Platonov. One of the writers who has is John Berger, the Marxist novelist, poet, art critic. I suppose he's best known as an art critic, who died a year or two ago. I was, once idly sort of searching, Googling Platonov just to see if anyone had written anything new about him, and I came across an article, which was then only on the internet, it was really an article about world poverty, but it was absolutely dense with quotations from Platonov, and it was by John Berger, and I got in contact with him, and we eventually used this article as an afterword in the New York Review of Books edition of Soul of John. So, I mean, John Berger has written a lot about refugees, about kind of guest workers in different countries, the displaced. So, you know, the themes of Jan are very, very close to John Berger's art. So he's really, I mean, I was very grateful to him for noticing our translations. He's really the only major writer who has responded to Platonov. Yeah, maybe, I mean, I am now about to return to our unfinished translation of Chivengur, so maybe when we get that published, that will bring him into public awareness. But he, I suppose he is such a very subtle writer that it does take people time to really notice him. So I can't really answer your question. It's much easier to ask that question with regard to someone like Grossman, who has been sort of taken up in a big way by language historians, above all. You know, it's historians rather than literary specialists who have made Grossman known in the West. I actually feel that, you know, I don't feel that either the literary world, English American literary world, have been very supportive of writers being newly translated.
Does it seem to you that Platonov, perhaps for his very elusive and even ambiguous message, if you'd like, precisely because of that, did he manage to somehow make this climate of the Cold War and the publishing during the Cold War a little bit less binary? Because there are really very few binaries in Platonov.
Yeah.
Everything flows together and...
Yeah. Well, yes, but I think I'd put it the other way around. It's because Platonov wasn't binary enough. He didn't get noticed the way he deserved. I don't really think Platonov, I don't really think it makes sense to think of Platonov greatly changing the climate, because people, I mean, especially the early artist translations were so very bad that they didn't get read at all.
All right. Lisa, do you have anything else to ask?
No, I think I got everything covered.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing what you both have written.
Okay, I will stop the recording. Just 1 second.